Ever notice how some people just seem to pick up languages like it's nothing?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
they go on vacation for a week and come back ordering coffee in fluent Italian?
Right. It's almost like,
Meanwhile, I'm over here still struggling to remember my Duolingo owl.
yeah, yeah.
Well, you sent over this fascinating chapter from a textbook that dives into this whole idea of the good language learner.
Yeah, it's a question that's kind of haunted researchers for a while now.
Like, is it nature or nurture?
Well, sort of. They're trying to figure out if there are certain characteristics, certain traits that make someone more likely to succeed at language learning.
Like personality.
Exactly. Or even things like motivation, age. They call these variables. And they're trying to see if any of them correlate with how well someone learns a new language.
So is it the super organized planner who always aces their language tests?
Maybe. Maybe.
Or is it the fearless social butterfly who's not afraid to butcher a few phrases along the way?
Right, right. I mean, they're looking into all of that.
It's like they're trying to crack the code to this whole language learning thing.
Exactly. And, it's actually really interesting how they try to even measure some of these things.
Oh, I bet. Because how do you even quantify something like motivation?
Exactly. And that's part of what the chapter digs into.
Speaking of interesting things to measure, there's this one point that really jumped out at me. It was about the willingness to make mistakes.
Oh, yeah, that's a good one.
Because isn't that kind of the key? Like, you have to be willing to sound silly at first, right?
Absolutely. And that's a really interesting one because it could be both a personality trait and an aspect of motivation.
Okay, I see what you mean.
Like some people are just naturally less afraid to put themselves out there, even if it means messing up.
Right, right.
But for others, it might be more about this drive to communicate,
Yeah.
even if it's not perfect.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So even just that one example shows how tricky it can be to tease apart all these different factors.
Yeah, for sure. It's definitely not a simple answer, is it?
No, not at all. And it gets even more complex when we start talking about this whole idea of correlation versus causation.
Uh-oh. I can already tell we're about to get into the nitty-gritty here.
We are. But it's good stuff. It's basically getting at this idea that just because two things seem to go together doesn't mean that one actually causes the other.
Okay, yeah, I've definitely fallen into that trap before.
And the textbook gives this great example. They talk about how researchers might notice that people who have tons of interaction with native speakers tend to score higher on language proficiency tests.
Okay, that makes sense on the surface.
Right, like more practice, better fluency. But, as always, it might not be that straightforward.
All right, I'm hooked. Tell me more.
It's kind of like, when people say, oh, you're so good at cooking, you must have a fantastic spice rack.
Right, right.
It's like, yeah, that makes sense. But did the cooking cause the spices? Or was it the spices that maybe even got them into cooking in the first place?
Okay, I see what you're saying. It's easy to jump to conclusions about what's really driving the results.
Right. It could be that those who are already more proficient in the language for whatever reason, maybe they have more aptitude or had early exposure when they were younger, maybe those are the people who are then more likely to seek out interactions with native speakers.
Because they feel more confident, so they're more likely to put themselves out there.
Exactly.
So the interaction itself might not be the secret ingredient. It's more like a byproduct of something else.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then to make things even more complicated, the chapter points out that it's not always easy to separate out the impact of external factors.
What do you mean by external factors?
Like the stuff outside of the individual's control. They use this example of the frequency of interaction with native speakers again.
Okay.
Because you might think someone who interacts with native speakers all the time, that must mean they're super motivated, right?
Yeah, they're putting in the effort to immerse themselves.
Right. But it could also just be that they live in a more diverse community, or maybe their job requires them to speak the language regularly.
So their environment is doing a lot of the heavy lifting, regardless of their personal motivation.
Exactly. It's like we can't always assume that someone's actions are solely based on internal factors like motivation, because their context plays a huge role.
It's like assuming someone who lives next door to a gym is going to be super fit.
Yeah. There could be other factors at play. And to complicate things even further, the chapter also highlights another challenge.
Yeah.
How do we even measure something as complex as language proficiency?
That's a good point. It's not exactly like measuring how high someone can jump.
Right. Some studies might use tests that focus mainly on grammar and vocabulary, while others might emphasize conversational fluency. So depending on what you're measuring, you might end up with completely different results about what makes a good language learner.
Oh, that makes total sense. So it's not just about identifying the traits, it's also about how we're defining success in the first place.
Absolutely. And you know what? The chapter uses this great example of IQ and language learning. Because some studies have found a link between having a high IQ and being good at language learning, while others haven't.
Really?
Yeah. And often it comes down to how they define and measure both IQ and language proficiency. It just goes to show you how research isn't always as black and white as we might think.
It kind of makes all those assumptions about natural language learners seem a lot less certain.
For sure. It's way more nuanced than that.
So if it's not just about these individual traits, what else is going on? It sounds like there's a whole other piece to this puzzle we haven't talked about yet.
There is, and the chapter does a good job of addressing it. Basically, even if we could perfectly identify all these so-called good learner qualities, it wouldn't tell the whole story. There's this whole social dimension to language learning that we can't ignore.
So are you saying it's not enough to just have the right skills or the right personality? It's also about the environment you're in.
Exactly. It's like, imagine someone who's learning to play basketball, right? They could have all the talent in the world, amazing hand-eye coordination, great instincts, but if they never actually get to play on a team, if they don't have a coach who pushes them, or even just a decent court to practice on, are they really going to reach their full potential? Probably not.
That's such a good analogy. Because it's the same with language, right? You can't just study the grammar rules in a vacuum. You have to actually use it, right?
Exactly. And you need the right environment to do that. The chapter talks about the importance of what they call meaningful interactions.
Meaningful interaction.
Yeah, and it's not just about being surrounded by the language, like passively hearing it. It's about actually feeling like a valued communication partner, like having the opportunity to use the language in a way that feels authentic and engaging.
Oh, I totally get that. I remember when I was trying to learn some Spanish through a language exchange, and I had this partner who just kept wanting to drill me on grammar rules.
Oh, no.
Not exactly the most inspiring conversation, let me tell you.
No, definitely not what we're talking about. That's a perfect example of how important it is to create those spaces where you feel comfortable making mistakes, where you feel like you can experiment and be understood, even if you're not perfectly fluent.
It's like, give me the space to mess up, and maybe I'll actually learn something.
Exactly. Because that's how we grow, right?
This whole conversation has been so eye-opening.
Yeah.
So to wrap things up, for anyone listening who might be feeling a little discouraged about their own language learning journey, what would you say is the biggest takeaway from all of this?
You know, if I had to boil it down, I think the most important thing to remember is that it's just way more complicated than just saying someone is good or bad at languages.
Right, like we're not all just born with a language gene or something.
Exactly. It's this whole mix of individual differences, the social context we find ourselves in, the approaches we take to learning. All of these things play a role.
It really is a journey, isn't it? With its ups and downs and detours and unexpected discoveries.
For sure. And I think, like you were saying earlier, comparison really is the thief of joy when it comes to this stuff.
Oh, 100%. We all have different strengths, different challenges, different paths.
Exactly. And understanding that both in ourselves and in others is so important.
So instead of striving to be the mythical good language learner, maybe we should focus on being the best learners we can be, given our own unique circumstances.
I love that because it's not about labeling ourselves. It's about understanding the process and finding the strategies that work for us.
It's about embracing the messiness of it all and enjoying the ride.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, on that note, we'd love to hear from you, our listeners. Think back on your own experiences learning a language. Were there any surprising factors that helped or hindered your progress? Share your thoughts with us on social media. We're always up for a good language learning chat. Until next time.